Welcome to EconWorks. We live in an era of massive platforms, global supply chains, and unprecedented market concentration. But behind every headline about a merger or a legal settlement, there is a deeper mechanical struggle for control. On this show, we pull back the curtain on the invisible forces shaping our economy. We look past the talking points to examine where law, power, and markets actually collide, and how those collisions redefine the world we live in. Coming to you from the EconWorks desk, we're diving into a breakdown of the systems that run our modern life. This is EconWorks. Today's episode, the $1.72 versus Ticketmaster.
Imagine you're buying a concert ticket online. You finally get through that brutal virtual waiting room, your adrenaline is pumping, and you pick your seats. And the base price looks, well, somewhat reasonable. But then you click over to the checkout screen, and bam, a mysterious $1.72 convenience fee gets tacked on.
Yeah, and I mean, it is incredibly annoying.
Right. But you pay it anyway because, you just really want to see the show.
Right.
But what if I told you that tiny, seemingly insignificant $1.72 is actually the center of a landmark legal battle, one that is threatening to dismantle a massive corporate empire?
I mean, it sounds totally absurd on the surface, but that specific number is currently testing the absolute limits of how we regulate monopolies in this country.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're opening up some fascinating source material today, a comprehensive economic and legal analysis called Ticketmaster, the Jury, and the Limits of State Antitrust Power.
And our mission here is really to trace the journey of this specific case. We're going from a deeply unresolved government settlement about 16 years ago, all the way to this phenomenally rare jury verdict.
And we'll look at what actually happens after a verdict like that, right?
Yeah.
We want to understand what this means for the live music market as a whole.
Right, and why that tiny $1.72 overcharge is legally massive. Plus, we really need to highlight the crucial difference between just winning an antitrust case on paper and actually fixing a broken market in the real world.
Yeah, because this isn't just dry legal text. It's honestly a detective story about market power, competing economic theories, and ultimately, your wallet. So to start, the weird part is the government actually tried to stop this whole ticketing monopoly back in 2010.
They did, yeah. And you really cannot understand where we are today without looking at the ghosts of 2010. Back then, the U.S. Department of Justice stepped in to challenge the massive merger between Live Nation and Ticketmaster.
Live Nation being the biggest concert promoter and Ticketmaster being the biggest ticketing platform.
It's exactly. The DOJ brought this challenge under the Sherman Act, which is basically the foundational antitrust law in the U.S. And the core concern was vertical integration.
Let's break that term down for a second. Vertical integration sounds like dry corporate jargon, but in the live music world, it means owning the whole food chain.
Yep, top to bottom.
Right. So if you are the promoter and you also own the venues and you also own the only ticketing platform those venues are allowed to use, you control the entire ecosystem, from the artist down to the fan.
Yeah, it was the exact fear. The DOJ was terrified that this newly merged giant would just use its dominance in concert promotion to essentially force venues to use their ticketing software.
Which would naturally exclude any rival ticketing platforms from competing at all?
Precisely. But here is the kicker. Despite raising those massive concerns, the case never actually went to trial. It was resolved through a consent decree.
A consent decree, meaning like a settlement.
Yeah, it's essentially a negotiated settlement that gets approved by a judge.
Yeah. Wait, so the government sees this giant vertically integrated threat, and instead of taking them to court and breaking them up, they just make them sign a promise to play nice.
Pretty much, yes. The 2010 settlement only imposed behavioral conditions.
Yeah.
So the newly merged company agreed to restrictions on retaliating against venues that used other platforms, and they agreed to certain software licensing requirements. But the really pivotal detail here is that there was absolutely no liability finding.
No liability finding.
None. There was no judicial determination that the market structure was an illegal monopoly or that it was actively causing harm.
Okay, let's unpack this. Settling out of court, that sounds like putting a behavioral Band-Aid on a leaky pipe without actually checking if the plumbing itself is fundamentally broken.
That is a great way to put it.
Because if you just tell a company, hey, don't retaliate against your rivals, but you let them keep the massive market share that makes retaliation possible in the first place, you haven't fixed the underlying mechanics. You just kicked the can down the road, right?
You did. The core economic questions of how that market actually functioned were left entirely untested. And to understand why a massive government agency would just settle like that, the sources introduced this concept of the antitrust litigation funnel.
The litigation funnel, okay, how does that work?
Well, if you picture the legal system as a wide funnel, thousands of antitrust cases are filed at the very top. But the attrition rate is just staggering.
Because proving a monopoly is incredibly difficult and expensive.
Oh, extremely. As you move down the funnel, only a few cases actually survive the early legal motions to dismiss. Moving further down, very few of those surviving cases ever make it to trial.
I'm guessing companies don't want to risk a trial.
Exactly. Trial outcomes in these complex economic cases are highly unpredictable. So both sides usually face immense pressure to settle. Reaching an actual jury verdict at the very bottom of the funnel is exceptionally rare.
Which brings us back to the present day. Because that canet that the DOJ kicked down the road in 2010, it was eventually picked up by a coalition of states.
Yeah, they took up the mantle.
They spent years building a case, and they actually managed to push it all the way through that massive litigation funnel, getting it in front of a jury.
And for the very first time, the plumbing of the live music industry was fully exposed in a courtroom. The trial ultimately boiled down to two completely competing economic theories interpreting the exact same business model.
Let's look at the narrative the states were pitching first. They presented a very specific causal chain, right? They said integration leads to control, which leads to exclusion, which ultimately results in higher prices.
Exactly. The states argued that because Live Nation and Ticketmaster are integrated, they wield immense control over the industry. And they alleged that the company used that control to engage in exclusionary conduct.
Like, what does that look like in practice?
For example, implicitly threatening venues that if they didn't use Ticketmaster, Live Nation wouldn't route major blockbuster tours through their buildings.
Wow.
Yeah, so that exclusion starves competing ticketing platforms of business. It creates a monopoly where Ticketmaster can just inflate fees without fear of losing customers.
A classic story of monopolistic abuse. But the defense came back with an entirely different interpretation. And, to be fair here, the defense's theory about efficiency isn't totally baseless, is it?
Not at all. It makes a certain kind of economic sense.
Right, because if one single company is handling the tour booking, the venue management, and the ticketing, it could technically streamline the entire operation.
The defense leaned heavily into that concept. Frictionless touring. Their causal chain was totally different. They said integration leads to efficiency, which leads to better coordination, which results in better outcomes for everyone.
Better for the artist and the fan.
Right. They argued that bringing everything under one roof reduces transaction costs and optimizes tour routing. Ultimately, they claimed it provides a superior service that piecemeal competitors simply cannot match.
They basically said their size wasn't a weapon, it was a feature. So you have a jury of regular people being asked to decide between two completely different ways of looking at a corporate giant. Is their size a weapon to crush rivals, or is it a tool to make concerts run smoother? How do the states actually definitively prove the harm part to a jury?
Well, to win, the states couldn't just rely on the general public sentiment that concert tickets are too expensive. We all know they are. But legally, they had to prove a strict domino effect of liability.
A four-step process, right?
Yes. First, they had to prove Live Nation Ticketmaster actually possessed monopoly power in the relevant market. Second, they had to prove the company maintained that power through specific exclusionary conduct.
Meaning they actively kept competitors out, rather than just being better at business.
Exactly. Third, they had to show that conduct caused harm to competition overall. And finally, the ultimate question, did it actually cause consumer harm?
They really had to prove every single link in that chain. Because if they prove the company is big but can't prove they excluded anyone, they lose. And if they prove exclusion but can't prove it actually hurt the consumer's wallet, they lose again.
It had to be a complete causal chain backed by layered economic evidence. And the jury systematically accepted all four steps.
Wow.
They agreed that the integration wasn't primarily creating efficiencies. It was actively excluding rivals. And crucially, it was extracting wealth from the people buying the tickets.
So the jury officially says, yes, you caused consumer harm. Now, naturally, as a consumer, you hear that, and you assume the jury uncovered some massive financial conspiracy. You assume they found the company was overcharging by like $50 a ticket.
Right. People expect a huge number. But this is where the source material gets genuinely surprising, and we circle back to that number from the very beginning of the show.
The $1.72?
Yes. The jury evaluated all the economic models and estimated that the overcharge, meaning the extra amount consumers were paying specifically because of the monopoly's lack of competition, was about $1.72 per ticket.
Wait, only $1.72. Let's put that in context. On a sample ticket with a face value of, say, $127, an overcharge of $1.72 is roughly 1 to 3%.
Yeah, just 1 to 3% of the ticket price.
If antitrust law is supposed to prevent massive consumer harm, how do states legally justify spending millions of taxpayer dollars on a decade-long legal battle over what amounts to a 1 to 3% price bump?
It sounds wild, I know. But that is the central tension of the case, and it requires looking at how antitrust law actually defines harm. The law doesn't use strict numeric thresholds.
So there's no rule saying it has to be a 10% markup to be illegal.
Exactly. There is no statute like that. Instead, the law simply asks if the harm is substantial, non-trivial, and meaningful within the context of the market.
I see. It is death by 1,000 cuts. $1.72 doesn't bankrupt you on a Friday night.
Yeah.
But if you multiply that by every single concert goer in the country, across millions and millions of tickets sold every year, that 1 to 3% becomes a massive wealth transfer.
Precisely. It's a wealth transfer from the public directly to a monopoly.
Yeah.
It is small per transaction, but it is massive in aggregate.
Mm-hmm.
And legally, that 1 to 3% is absolutely sufficient to win the liability phase of the case.
It proves the harm actually happened.
Yes. However, that seemingly low $1.72 number becomes a huge complication when we move to the next concept in the source material, the relationship between magnitude and remedy.
Because the size of the harm dictates the size of the punishment.
Exactly. Courts calibrate their intervention based on the severity of the market distortion. It exists on a spectrum. On one end, you have smaller scale harm. A 1 to 3% overcharge is a serious issue, but it typically justifies what are called conduct remedies.
Like the leaky pipe we talked about earlier, you tighten the bolts and patch the system. That means stricter behavioral relief, telling them how to operate and forcing them to pay financial damages.
Yes. Because the jury found liability, the damages tied to that $1.72 overcharge will likely be awarded. And under federal antitrust law, those damages can potentially be trebled. Meaning tripled.
Tripled, yes.
Yes.
It's used as a punitive measure to deter future monopolistic behavior. So the financial penalty can still be really substantial.
But what about the other end of the spectrum? What if the states had proven the overcharge was like 20 or 30%?
Well, that level of severe market distortion is the burst water main, and that justifies structural remedies. Structural remedies involve actual market restructuring, which in this case would mean a corporate breakup.
Literally forcing Live Nation and Ticketmaster to split into two entirely separate companies again.
Exactly.
So if the harm is only in that 1 to 3% range, how does that impact the possibility of a breakup?
The analysis in our sources indicates that because the magnitude of the harm is relatively small per ticket, a full structural breakup of the companies is possible, but highly unlikely.
Really? Even after all that work? Yeah, the courts are generally very hesitant to order massive corporate divestitures when the proven consumer effect is in the low single digits. The small magnitude of the overcharge ultimately limits the severity of the remedies the court is willing to impose.
That is fascinating. So the states pushed this through the funnel. They convinced a jury to systematically reject the efficiency argument, they proved the monopoly exists, and they established the $1.72 harm. So how do they actually implement the fix? Who writes the new rules?
This introduces another huge bottleneck that the analysis calls the Antitrust Decision Funnel. The case now shifts into an entirely different phase, governed by a very strict division of power in the American legal system, because the jury's job is completely finished.
Wait, they just pack up and go home?
They do. In our system, the jury's sole role in an antitrust case is to determine the facts. They listened to the dueling economic theories and decided, as a matter of fact, that monopoly power exists and it caused $1.72 of harm. But they do not decide the punishment or the market solution.
Wait a second. The state spent years doing all the heavy lifting to get this incredibly rare jury verdict, and they don't even get to dictate the remedy. They just hand the baton over and hope for the best.
That is the ultimate limit of state antitrust power. The judge defines the law during the trial, and in this final stage, the federal judge alone decides the equitable remedies.
Just the judge.
Just the judge. The states can bring the cases, they can fund the litigation, and they can secure the liability finding. But they absolutely cannot restructure the markets themselves. That power rests entirely with the judge.
It makes you wonder why a jury was even involved in the first place. If the judge holds all the cards regarding how to fix the market at the end of the day, why not just have the judge hear the whole case from the start?
That's a great point. The only reason a jury was involved here is because the coalition of states specifically sought monetary damages on behalf of consumers.
Ah, the money.
Right. Seeking financial damages triggers the constitutional right to a jury trial. If the Department of Justice had brought this case alone, seeking only to restructure the market without asking for a payout to consumers, it would have been a bench trial.
Meaning no jury at all, just a single judge deciding the facts, applying the law, and determining the remedies from day one.
Exactly. The state's demand for consumer damages forced a jury trial, which secured them the hard-fought liability win. But they still run right into the bottleneck of the judge for the actual structural solution. It is a grueling, multi-stage process where proving your case is literally only half the battle.
States file claims, a jury finds liability, and a single judge decides the remedies. It is an incredibly complex, highly uncertain process that routinely takes decades to play out. And honestly, if you are listening to this and you're just tired of paying exorbitant fees, you have to be wondering if there's an easier way to make tickets cheaper without spending 16 years in a legal funnel.
Well, our sources actually point to a completely different jurisdiction to explore an alternative approach. While the U.S. case was crawling through litigation, Ontario, Canada took a totally different path.
What did they do?
They bypassed antitrust litigation entirely and implemented direct price regulation.
Instead of suing the monopoly, they just changed the laws around pricing. How does that work in practice?
Rather than spending years trying to prove monopoly power or exclusionary conduct in the courtroom, the provincial government identified the immediate problem, which was high prices, and they passed a law capping the price of resale tickets at their original face value.
Wow, just a hard external constraint imposed by the government.
Yes, you cannot sell this ticket for more than you bought it for.
Yeah.
And it provides a really stark contrast in economic philosophy.
Let's look at that contrast.
Sure, let's look at the regulation path first.
Yeah.
The government imposes a cap, and the result is that prices drop immediately. The outcome is highly predictable and provides instant relief to the consumer.
It is like taking a powerful painkiller for a broken arm. It treats the symptom, the high prices, immediately so the patient feels better. But capping the price doesn't actually stop the ticketing platform from being a monopoly. The bone is still broken.
The source analysis highlights that exact limitation. Price regulation lowers the cost to the consumer, but it does not restore competition to the market.
Because it doesn't change the underlying structure.
Right. Capping prices doesn't lower the barriers to entry, it doesn't prevent a dominant company from locking up venues, and it certainly doesn't create a second ticketing platform to offer better service. The underlying monopoly dynamics persist. The pricing is just externally suppressed.
The pain is gone, but the structural damage remains. So the antitrust path we take in the U.S., as grueling as it is the surgery.
The antitrust path is the surgery. It is invasive, it's uncertain, and it takes years to heal. Under antitrust logic, you challenge the exclusionary conduct through legal action to shatter the barriers keeping competitors out.
And once those barriers are gone?
The philosophy is that once competition is restored, new companies will enter the market. They will compete on fees and service to attract customers, and the prices will adjust endogenously.
Endogenously. Meaning the prices drop naturally from within the market itself, driven by competition, rather than being forced down by a government cap.
Precisely. The underlying belief of antitrust law is that a healthy, competitive market will naturally regulate its own prices. But, as we've seen from tracking this journey since 2010, proving that exclusion occurred and successfully restoring that competition is an incredibly arduous process.
It really is a massive undertaking, and it puts the entire system into perspective. I mean, we started today by looking at the unresolved questions of 2010. The government saw a threat, but settled for a behavioral band-aid that left the core mechanics of the monopoly totally untested.
Leaving the heavy lifting for the future.
Right. Then we followed the coalition of states as they pushed this case all the way through the extreme attrition of the antitrust litigation funnel. They presented a clear causal chain to a jury, proving that integration led to exclusion, which ultimately harmed the consumer.
Securing a landmark liability finding based on a seemingly tiny $1.72 overcharge. A 1 to 3% margin that is legally sufficient to win the battle, but perhaps not severe enough to justify a massive structural breakup of the companies.
And finally, we hit the bottleneck of the decision funnel. The profound realization that the states and the jury have done their part, but they don't hold the keys. The final power to decide the remedies, to actually fix the broken market, rests entirely with the single federal judge.
It perfectly illustrates the limits of state antitrust power. They can force the issue, and they can prove the harm, but they cannot independently dictate the terms of the peace.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters to you. The next time you are staring at a checkout screen watching those mysterious fees inflate, or the next time you see a headline about a massive corporate mega merger being challenged in court, you are going to look right past the surface level news.
You'll know the real story.
You will know that proving a monopoly exists is really only half the battle. The remedy phase, the quiet part where a judge decides whether to fundamentally break up a company or just issue a financial penalty, that is where the real war is fought.
It absolutely changes how you evaluate whether our legal system is actually working.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought to mull over today. If a determined coalition of states can get everything right, if they can spend a decade gathering evidence, push a case through the funnel, successfully prove monopoly power, and prove consumer harm to a jury of their peers, but they still might not have the power to force a structural change in the market.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, is our current legal toolkit actually equipped to handle the modern megacorporation? Or despite all the courtroom drama, are we destined to just keep patching leaky pipes forever?
A vital question as markets continue to consolidate.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Econ Works. The goal of this series is to move beyond the surface-level descriptions of how markets work and start looking at the actual architecture of competition. We'll be back soon with another look at where the law and economics meet the market. For the full technical analysis and more from this series, visit us at econworks.com. If you found today's breakdown valuable, please subscribe and share the show. It helps us keep the analysis independent. From all of us here at Econ Works, thanks for listening.